And I hasten to add here that the University of Arizona, its Tucson campus, occupies the ancestral lands of the Tohono O'odham, Pasquayaqui, and Apache peoples. And the state of Arizona is also the homeland of more than 20 other tribal nations. We respect their cultures and histories as well as those of indigenous peoples everywhere. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. James Mestaz, Assistant Professor of History at Sonoma State University, California. Dr. Mestaz was born in Long Beach, raised in the San Joaquin Valley, earned degrees from UCLA and the University of Miami before going on to earn a doctorate from the University of Illinois at Chicago under the direction of Chris Boyer, who's a top-notch scholar in the field of Mexican environmental history. James's dissertation committee also included yours truly, who continues to learn a great deal from James's excellent research and from the example he has set as a passionate and empathetic teacher and mentor. So Dr. Mestaz is going to be talking to us today about his research with the Mayo or Yoreme indigenous people of the lower Fuerte River Basin in northern Sinaloa, and the ways in which they shaped and resisted the forces of irrigation development on the part of the federal government and local interests. All of this is the basis of James's book, Strength from the Waters, which is published by the University of Nebraska Press, and I highly recommend it. So James will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we should have plenty of time for Q&A after that. And once we get to that point, I'll sort of let everybody know how we want to operate that. And then we will get things wrapped up no later than 5 o'clock. So Dr. Mestaz, you have the screen. Take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you both Jeff and Carlos and for the Southwest Center for this invitation. All of University of Arizona, really appreciate it. So yeah, and thank you to everybody who also made this book happen, essentially, right? I have way too many people I can name. It would take me the whole 45 minutes to even get to everybody. So I will just say that Jeff Bannister was definitely a huge, huge help in this. And I know some people that are attending also. I'd like to thank many of them as well. So again, I will be talking about my book, which was published 2 years ago, Strength from the Waters. So as we know, and as we're reminded by such protests as No Dapple Movement in Standing Rock, water is life. We need to drink water every day in order to survive. But in this presentation and in my book, I'll be talking about some of the other uses of water that go beyond just drinking water. Essentially, this book is bigger than just the Mayo people. And bigger than just talking about Mexico and the history of Mexico. It's basically a book that talks about humans and their changing interaction with water. And basically what it means when water becomes treated less as a human right and is started to be treated as more of a commodity. Jeff already did the land acknowledgement. This is what I would say if I was in Tucson. But we're not. But I will say that since we're all in different places, that pretty much all of us in the Americas are sitting on indigenous lands at some point. So that's something that we should all definitely respect and should impact our actions moving forward. And that many of the ways that indigenous people from all over the Americas treated their water is similar to the way that the Mayo people approach their water systems as well. So essentially, this presentation, I will talk about, first of all, my research, right? How did it come about? How did I conduct the research? What was it all about? I'll give a little bit of historical background. Then I'll get to the case studies, 3 different eras that I talk about in the book, which gives a clear indication of what the book is really about. So to start off, just to kind of an opening to this, in 1956, in the Mayo village of El Teroque, some indigenous members there wrote to the federal government and wanted help. They basically said that they wanted to gain more access to the river system and that some of the members of their village, who are all indigenous, were no longer indigenous. In fact, according to them, they were all white now, largely because of the way that they were approaching their river system. So what causes division? how did water cause this division in particular, especially when just a few decades earlier, it had led to such major unity prior to that? So who are the Mayo people? First, before I get there, I just wanted to mention that this map that I have here did not exist, essentially, right? I had to actually use a lot of old maps and several other things to bring this together and come together with a cartographer in order to draw this map to get all of these major Mayo villages on one map around the Fuerte River. This kind of just speaks to their invisibility historically. So the Mayo people in the Fuerte Valley are based around the Fuerte River here. The Fuerte River is 180 miles long. It's so large that it's able to irrigate about a million acres of land. As you can see here in this inset map, the Fuerte Valley down here is about a 10-hour drive from the border of Arizona. So the Mayo people consider themselves Yoremes, and they call outsiders, non-Mayo people, Yoris. There's about 15,000 Mayo Yoremes in the Fuerte Valley currently, and that's about the same number as there was in the early 20th century, which we'll be talking about today. They're joined in a broader cultural linguistic group with Yaqui people of Sonora, and as well, other Mayo people in also the state of Sonora. So the Mayo people had always had a natural connection to the river system. In fact, the word Mayo comes from the Mayo word Mayombo, which means the river people. So essentially, the Mayo people, though, had always set themselves apart by their use of irrigation infrastructure to protect their land and water systems. And we'll be talking about that. So how did I come about choosing this topic? Those of us who have a PhD know that it's not easy to come up with a topic. It took me a long time to figure out what I wanted to do. I always knew I wanted to write about Indigenous people, largely because I have Indigenous blood on both sides of my family. My mother's side, I have Tara Umara blood, or Raramuri, and on my father's side, I have Yaqui blood. So I always wanted to talk about Indigenous people and especially their connections to their ecosystems. So how did they approach their natural landscapes, and what could we learn about that approach in order to solve some of the problems that we have today with our connection to our natural environment? So I started looking into possibly studying the Yaqui people. There had been just countless books and articles and things written about the Yaqui people, movies, so much stuff written about them and focused on them that it was hard for me to find something that actually fit and that was new. Right. And so my advisor kind of, asked me, what are you going to do that's new? And I couldn't really answer him. So I started looking at the Tarahumara or Raramuri people of Chihuahua and maybe doing some research there. I realized it was actually kind of dangerous to do research there. It still kind of is a little bit. So while I was doing research on both of these people, I kept coming across the word Mayo. I had never heard of Mayo people, to be honest with you. And it fascinated me. And the more I researched the Mayo people, the more I realized how their civilizations had always centered around the river systems. And so growing up in a small town called Three Rivers, I had always been very connected to my river system. Growing up there was really a big part of my life. So I figured if I could write about not just Indigenous people, but a river system at the same time, this was like the perfect topic. So this study then turned into not just an environmental history, but also an ethnohistory. So once I started doing my research on the Mayo people, then I went down to Mexico after my second year, my PhD program, and I started doing some research, some pre-dissertation research. So I thought that I would find something similar to what other scholars had found in the Mayo Valley. For instance, Jeff Bannister, who is with us today, wrote a really incredible dissertation, and I was just impressed by it. I just really loved it. And in his dissertation, he talks about the Mayo people in the Mayo Valley, Sonora, and how they had subverted the irrigation systems there. Basically, they had built weirs and fence rows, which diverted water away from their river system into their fields. And this really upset the landowners there because it would interfere with their irrigation system. So the Mayo people really had no access to these irrigation systems. So I thought I'd find something similar to what the Mayo people in the Fuerte Valley were doing, same as the Mayo Valley. Actually, I found something quite different, and that's related to this document that I found, written in 1931 from Los Gorros, a Mayo village. Basically, the Mayo people there wrote to the federal government asking for permission to use a pump and a canal to draw water away from the Fuerte River and to irrigate their canals. And these pumps and canals actually belonged to a Yori, a non-Mayo person. So to some people, this might not seem like a big deal, but to me, it was groundbreaking. It was something I had never seen before. Not only did the Mayo people want to collaborate with the post-revolutionary government, which I had not seen in this region, but they also wanted to collaborate with this non-Mayo person as well. And so this really got me thinking, oh, wow, is this common here? So I kept doing research in the archives in Mexico City, actually found many more documents that supported this, that Mayo people had actually used this irrigation infrastructure to their own purposes and collaborated with the federal government. So I took this information from the few weeks that I got this, was looking in the archives, and I went to Sinaloa, and I found a professor working in an autonomous indigenous university outside of Los Mochis, Sinaloa. And he said he would be happy to take me around to Mayo villages to interview elders. And I was really, really happy about this. And so took that information, went back, finished my third year of the PhD, and went back following my third year to do the research. And so I went down to Mexico City for 6 months, went to about 7 different archives there. And it was great. I found just a lot of really amazing information, took thousands of photographs of these documents that I found. And then I spent another 6 months in Los Mochis, interviewing about 40 Mayo elders and about 10 water experts as well. And so what I would do was I would compare the oral interviews to the documents. In fact, I would fashion many of my questions for the oral interviews from the documents alone. So what did I find the documents in a particular village? I would ask the participants, oral interview participants, do you remember this happening? Even though a lot of it happened in the 1930s and 1940s. And I would often have different histories. So what was said from the oral history was not always the same thing as what was in the documents. So how do I make sense of that? Well, largely it's not just what the oral histories were saying, but it's largely their historical memory. How did they remember these certain things in history, right? And it's often the way that they remember these things is more important than what actually happened. So that's how I was using these oral histories, essentially. So getting back to some history, in the late 19th century, Mayo people in the Fuerte Valley had a lot of their lands taken as outsiders were coming in and essentially building large irrigation infrastructure, which was taking water away from the Fuerte River. So as water was being drained from the Fuerte River, the flow lessened. And Mayo people had always depended on the annual overflow of the Fuerte River to water their crops. Essentially, what they would do is they would wait for the waters to recede. And in the damp land, as the waters receded, they would plant their seeds there. But as waters became less and less, the river didn't overflow like it used to. So because of this, and because their lands were being taken away, Mayo people rebelled. About 6,000 Mayo people rose up in arms against these large landowners to try to win their land and water rights back. This rebellion was mostly crushed by the 1916, 1916, so they had to find other ways to win back these rights. They kind of thought they would win these rights back in 1917 with the 1970 Constitution of Mexico after the Mexican Revolution. And in the Constitution, it basically says that land and water is national property, but it would be given basically to peasant people, right, in order to assist them to grow crops. So they would use these usufruct rights. However, the first decade or so after this was signed, the Mexican presidents largely ignored this and did not give most of these lands back to the peasant people. This started to change a little bit in 1926 with a water law that was signed, which basically said that all entities, including large landowners and companies and peasant people and indigenous people, all had equal access to water rights, and they could all apply for these concessions equally, and that the government would have to look at them equally. So Mayo people saw this as their opening, and they said, okay, maybe this is a way for us to gain these water rights back. And so many of them started to actually use irrigation infrastructure and rights to this irrigation infrastructure to protect both their land and their connection to the Fuerte River. What was this connection? Well, Daniel Galaviz, a Mayo elder, says that the river, it serves all creatures and breathes, thinks, and reacts. It gives us life, but through rituals, we pay homage and tribute for all that the river has done for us. So you had to give in order to receive. Mayo people, in fact, saw the Fuerte River as the lifeblood of their culture, essentially, and their identity. So they felt that they were guardians, actually, stewards of the Fuerte River. This is also where they performed their river ceremonies. So these were like religious ceremonies, essentially, and this tied them to not only the river itself, but also to each other. So just some comparison, while this is going on in Mexico, in the United States, Native people were having a difficult time. 1908 Winter's Doctrine basically said that Native American people had rights to their water systems on their lands. Most of these were on reservation lands. But most of this was not being abided by. It was largely ignored by non-Native people. So for instance, Native people lost their water rights to the Salt River Reservation. The Arizona Yavapai people lost these water rights. And in New Mexico, Santa Ana Pueblo people lost their rights to the Bernalillo Community Ditch. So essentially, in the United States, concessions were not open as they should have been, at least not as much as they were in Mexico. And Mexican indigenous people often took advantage of this. So my book, therefore, talks about three eras of what I term hydraulic social mobilization, essentially a popular mobilization to acquire water rights. In this first era, from the mid-1920s, early 1940s, Mayo people used irrigation infrastructure to protect their water rights and their approach to their natural landscape, essentially. In the second era, from the early 1940s, mid-1950s, this was dominated by a sugarcane cooperative, and Mayo people both joined and fought against this cooperative, which actually gave them more of a voice within local development decisions. And in this last era, Mayo people had basically lost all their rights in the mid-1950s, 1970, and they were trying to cling to some of the strategies they had used before, and it just was not working for them. So I will talk about these eras, and I will give specific examples in all of these three eras. So in this first era, sort of the end of this era, this first era, when Mayo people had actual rights to their river system, the same village I talked about before, Los Gorros, 11 years later after this first document that I found, in 1942, other leaders had wrote to the federal government. They basically complained that a company was moving in. They were trying to widen a canal that was in their village, actually. And they were attempting to widen the canal. And as they widened the canal, they were also attempting to take the land away from them. So they were not at all happy with this. They went to local politicians and said, hey, we need your help. This is what's happening. And it turns out there was corruption. Some of these local politicians actually owned stock in the company and said, we're not going to help you. We're not going to go against our best interests. So they went above their heads, went to the federal government, wrote a petition to them, and said, hey, even the local, local politicians aren't helping us. What can you do? And the federal government actually had their back and said, okay, wait, you have a right. You are absolutely right. They cannot take this canal away from you. They cannot take your water rights away from you. This is your canal. You guys actually built it. So this shows that in this era, Mayo people, indigenous people in general, had still these rights, but they were soon going to be taken away from them. So this also showed that relationship with water providers had changed a little bit, because before they were able to work with these outsiders. As I mentioned before, this non-Mayo farmer was willing to negotiate with them and willing to let them use his canal and pumps to drain water from the Fuerte River. Now water was becoming really, really expensive. And so it was really more difficult for Mayo people to depend on outsiders to collaborate with. What's most fascinating about this document, though, is the way that they refer to the canal itself. So in the document, it says that you need to take into account the special circumstances of having built the canal ourselves and our desire to the guarantee of our patrimonio. So those of us who speak Spanish know that patrimonio has a few definitions. Now, number one, definitely they meant property, right? So this helped them to preserve their crops. It was important to the material wealth of their community. So they really meant it as property. So number one, for sure. But they also meant it as part of their heritage or their legacy. So the canal really helped them to maintain this connection to their river system, right? Because it was bringing water from the Fuerte River, right? They don't care that it's, that's a man-made canal. It's still the water, which they believed was sacred water. So this helped them also to continue to perform their religious ceremonies, even if sometimes they had to conduct these ceremonies in the canal itself. It was almost like the canal had become like a member of their community to an extent. It wasn't necessarily like a living, breathing entity like they saw forests or the river itself or, other things like that, or mountains, for instance. But it had become that important to them that they were willing to preserve it and protect it as much as they possibly could and do everything they can to do that. It's also important that these hydraulic technologies like canals actually helped these Mayo people to protect their cultural autonomy. So the 1970 Constitution, some of you might have heard about this. Basically, it's the first constitution in the Western Hemisphere, some people would say the world, to really include a social agenda. The government has to help the people, essentially. A lot of countries saw this and said, well, Mexican Revolution, almost over 1 million people died. Maybe we don't want some things to repeat like that. Maybe we should, update our constitutions to, include the state's responsibilities as citizens. Bolivia is actually an example of this, that actually changed their constitution, and it was largely influenced by the Mexican Constitution. As well, 1926 water law, people saw this and said, oh, wow, water governance might actually bring some sort of egalitarianism. It actually has that power to do this. So is Mexico onto something? Maybe we should look closer. And Mexico, and as we'll see through this presentation, Mexico often led the pack in Latin America in setting precedents. So in this second era, which I talk about in the book, only a few years later, at this first example, a different Mayo village, Jahuara, sent a petition to the federal government. They wanted permission to use a canal and a pump. So a pump was going to, if you could see in this document here, they was going to drain water away from the Jahuara Lagoon, and it was going to bring the water into these canals, and it was going to water these bean crop fields. And in this drained damp land here, they were going to use this to plant additional seeds, cornfield, make it a cornfield essentially. So why is this so important? For a few reasons. Number one, it's resurrecting this ancient technology, right? So number one, I mean, as I mentioned before, Mayo people had depended on the annual overflow of the river. They planted seeds as the waters receded, right in the damp land. So they're resurrecting this old technology. right? And it would have worked really well. Yet they weren't throwing out this new modern technology either, because this modern technology was also going to work well for them. And so they're combining the two of them. And it was actually quite ingenious the way they were going to do it. And so they really needed to know the natural landscape quite well in order to carry this thing out. And so they were able to do that. They started to construct this thing, but eventually they were not given permission. And so they ended up having to stop construction on this. Largely, this wasn't approved for one reason. I think a lot of these local politicians didn't want to listen to a bunch of indigenous people how to run their irrigation systems, but also because a cooperative essentially was dominating the Fuerte Valley, and they were calling the shots essentially. So this sugarcane cooperative called the Sikai Sugarcane Cooperative started in 1938 when Mexico's most left-leaning president, Lázaro Cárdenas, expropriated lands from large sugarcane companies, many of those from U.S. owners, and they redistributed a lot of thousands of acres to this cooperative. And in 1943, they actually created a water monopoly 4 months out of the year. So if you were not part of this cooperative, you could not drain water away from the Fuerte River. Large landowners were really upset by this. So after 1938 and even into the 1950s, collectivists, or those joining the cooperative, basically lined up against individualists, those who were not allowed to join the cooperative. And there became a massive split between the two, largely because the collectivists, because they had so much power and the backing of the federal government, thought that they could go in and move in and just kind of take a lot of the irrigated land away from the individualists. And individuals were not at all happy about that. In fact, this caused divisions, complete splits. Some of the villages split in two, especially some of the Mayo villages. So this brings us back to this very, very first case study that I talked about, El Toroque, right, in the 1950s, where these indigenous people said, yeah, these members of our community are no longer indigenous, they're actually white. Largely because, as I said, they were not treating the Fuerte River the way it was supposed to be treated, the way indigenous people had historically treated the river, which meant that it was for everybody, right? They were trying to take it and monopolize it themselves. And they saw that as a non-indigenous action, essentially, and said, you forfeited your indigenous rights, essentially. You're no longer indigenous. So essentially, this means that cultural practice and not race or ethnicity really determine Mayo membership, essentially. So whether Mayo people joined or fought against the cooperative, this gave them more of a voice within local development decisions. They had power if they joined, but also their enemies, who ended up being very powerful politically, also gave these Mayo leaders often a voice as well to figure out what to do with the local landscape. So this water monopoly from 1943 was largely given to the cooperative because they wanted sugarcane to flourish, right? Because this is right during World War II, essentially. They depended on Mexico for foodstuff, for the Allies, for the foodstuffs, and so they needed to produce more and more sugarcane. Also, cooperatives, about 700, 800 of them existed in Mexico at the time. This was sort of a blueprint for development. A lot of people were looking at Mexico again and saying, hey, how are they doing this? Is this going to actually work? Could they not only provide for their peasant people and indigenous people, but could it also benefit the economy at the same time, which would have been a difficult feat for anybody to pull off. But a lot of people hoped Mexico could do this. Unfortunately, they weren't able to completely. It didn't work as well as they hoped it to. So they kind of shifted gears in the 1950s and 1960s and started trying to produce commercially, agricultural commercially, and giving these water and land rights to large landowners and companies, essentially. So this large-scale agriculture depended on creating huge irrigation infrastructure. So one of these things that they built was these massive dams, as you can see in this picture here. And as you can see in this dam, which is the Hidalgo Dam, which is in the Fuerte Valley, it created these huge, basically lakes of water, right? Where people had to be displaced. A lot of them were Mayo people, and also flora and fauna, right? So Mayo people had developed a connection to this land over time. And once they were displaced, they were given new lands, but they didn't have the same connection that they needed, the same spiritual connection to their ecosystems. So you would think this would displace them and prevent them from carrying out their religious ceremonies. But in fact, even up till today, Mayo people still come to the banks of these waters and still perform their ceremonies next to the land that used to be there. So they still have this connection to the land, even though this development tried to displace them from that. So it was important because, again, other countries are looking at Mexico, and as a leader, they're saying, can Mexico pull this sort of large-scale development and agriculture? Can they pull it off, right? Would this benefit them? It was working in the United States to an extent, but that's the United States. They had money to put behind it. But could Mexico make this transition, and would it work well for everybody, not just for the rich people, but for everybody, for peasant people, for indigenous people? Would it benefit them at all? Others were looking at, okay, well, what is the cultural and environmental impact of this as you're separating people from their lands and giving a lot of these lands to these large farm owners? So one of these worries was the ecological aspect. Large forests had to be cleared to make room for this agricultural development. Mayo people had always set aside these forests for religious ceremonies, for instance. This is where they performed a lot of their ceremonies. They would also collect wood there for medicinal plants. Sometimes they would also collect things in order to build ceremonial objects. For instance, cottonwood or alamo trees is where they would get these alamo trees, and they would, with the wood, create ramadas. So ramadas are basically shelters where they perform their religious ceremonies. And as alamo trees started to disappear, elders became concerned that, well, would these new types of wood that we have to use now, do they carry the same type of properties, spiritual properties, that the alamo trees carry? And many said, no, they do not. So they were completely, interfering with their religious ceremonies, essentially. Mayo elder Aurelia Flores says, unfortunately, they cut down forests to grow food. Yoris, these non-indigenous people, see land as money. We, in fact, see it as life. So there was definitely a difference between the way that Mayo people and non-Mayo people approach their natural landscape. So throughout all this research, I kept coming across documents that were always signed by men. But again, as I mentioned before, there's this disconnect between what I'm finding in the documents and what I'm hearing in these oral histories. So men essentially were representing their villages all the time, largely because, well, it was a very machista society, right? Very patriarchal, in which men kind of had to be the leaders, and I've actually heard this, they were kind of afraid that these non-indigenous people would not even take them seriously if they actually had women signing these documents, or that if they found out that women were the leaders, they might not even listen to them, which is just ridiculous. But you can kind of see their point to an extent, even though it wasn't right. But as I talked to these elders and their oral histories, I found more and more, especially men were admitting this, that the women were mostly the ones that were making the decisions, especially when it had to deal with the natural landscape and their approaches to the natural landscape. And this is largely because women knew more about the natural landscape than men did. Women were the ones who went out into the forests and gathered things to build for religious ceremonies. They were the ones that went to the river. They would actually communicate and talk to the river. They would talk to trees. And because of this knowledge, they knew what was best for not only their villages, but for the natural landscape and their ecosystems as well. So women really always came with the best ideas, even though it's not, reflected in the documents, but it is reflected in these oral histories, and it continues to be, as we can see through not just the Mayo people, but a lot of indigenous groups as well. So as I wind down with this presentation, I look forward to people's questions. I've had a lot of people through the years, these last 2 years, ask me a lot of times, how could they help me in promoting my book? Being here is number one. That's a huge thing. I really appreciate everybody's support. Every time I have events like this, coming to this is absolutely something I really appreciate. But if you haven't purchased the book yet, please purchase it. That would be great. Again, the title is Strength from the Waters, A History of Indigenous Mobilization in Northwest Mexico. You can purchase it through either University of Nebraska Press. I'll make this available. I'll try to put this in the chat if I can, the link here. And you could buy that from them directly, or you can send me an email. I have ways that you can buy the book digitally, and I could send you a signed copy. I could email it to you. I can mail it to you, not email, mail it to you. If you're in the United States. If you're in Mexico, I could figure out a way. I usually travel to Mexico, and I may be able to visit you and drop it off to you. If you cannot purchase it from me, or if you've already purchased it, you could also help me in other ways. One way is if you're with an institution, if you're a professor or staff or whatever have you, please request it for your institution's library. This really helps me out a lot. Or you could request a copy at your local bookstore. So doing both of those two things are really big, because it shows these presses, they get this information. And so while I'm working on my second book, and I'll answer more questions about that if people are interested in hearing about my second book project, which I've just started doing research on. As I shop this around to different presses, that will give me leverage essentially as I, try to get this second book published. So I really look forward to all of your questions. I'm sure we have at least, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes or something like that, to answer some of these questions. And I thank you again.
Thank you so much, James. That was really great. And we definitely have plenty of time.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so
stop the share.
Go ahead, say that again.
I stopped the share, so they
okay,
can.
Thank you. Yeah. So for those of you who have questions, there's a couple ways we can do this. If you want to just raise your hand, and I'll just kind of be roaming around the Zoom trying to see if anyone has their hands raised, and I'll be watching the chat box here for a bit. But I think actually I would like to start the ball rolling here actually by asking you a question or two. So your research is so rich, James, and I just so appreciate it. And as you're talking, I was thinking about archival sources and working on water in Mexico, and sort of reflecting on the incredible richness of the historiography, the Mexican historiography. There is the broader, Mexicanist historiography that includes much publication from the U.S. And the Mexican historiography is amazing. And this is something that unless you're really getting into it, you might not understand if you're looking at it from the U.S. side of things. So I just wondered if you could just reflect a little bit about your experience working in the archives in Mexico, digging around in the Mexican historiography, and also especially in the area of water, because there are just some amazing scholars of water in Mexico.
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. Yeah, no, doing archival research is not always easy. You spend just hours and hours just pouring through documents and taking photos. It gets tiring, and it's not always easy. There's bureaucracy to go through. You know, you go to an archive and you're like, here's my documents. And, you know, you have to bring like a letter with you of introduction, and you have to ask permission, and you have to like clearly outline what you wanted, research. And then, you think you have everything, and they're like, oh, you're missing this. And you're like, oh, sorry, I have to bring that back tomorrow. So yeah, so I'll bring this back tomorrow. And then you think you have everything, you bring it to them, and they're like, okay, yeah, let me bring this to my supervisor. We'll let you know by next week. And so luckily I had a few different archives to go to. So I didn't depend on a certain one. So it's like, okay, I can't do research in this one. Let me go to this other one. So I would just do that. And just like, I'd have like, all these different balls in place at once. Right. It was just like, yeah, it was like, all right, if I can't do this, I'll do that. I'd always have a backup plan. And I think that was one of the most important things for me to really figure out. But it really helped that there was a lot of supportive people, right? There were just so many people that really archivists and scholars, especially from Mexico, that really had questions for me and really wanted to help me to sort of figure out what I was doing, right? And to give me access to this stuff, which I could really never pay them back. And looking at some of the scholarship, I mean, I looked at, for instance, Aboites. Aboites is anybody who does anything on water. He's basically sort of the king of water research in Mexico. He had a really huge influence, and I got to actually meet him, which was really cool. And so going to meet him, and he really helped me to figure out what exactly my project was about. And just like 45-minute meeting with him just went so far in figuring out what my research was actually going to be about. So I'll really forever, be indebted to him. McKill Wolf also, his work on water, that it was, huge, just the way he framed his talks about water, just so important. And he actually helped me to think about the book as well, and with you as well, Jeff, like your work, not just your dissertation, but all your articles, really helped me to consider, where I want to take this research. So yeah, I mean, I could talk for days about, my my experiences, even my experiences working in the general archive that used to be the prison there, Lecumberri prison, right? Which always kind of creeped me out, because that's where a lot of students like had been taken and tortured. And, just kind of reflecting on that and just the way that it's set up. I always had a kind of strange feeling about that, right? That I'm doing something positive, but I'm, in a kind of strange place at the same time. But yeah, I could go on and on about this, but, I do want to get to other people's questions if people have them.
Sure. Adventures in the Archive in Mexico, amazing. And I actually will just add that there, for those of you who might not know this, there's also an incredible historical water archive in Mexico City.
Yes.
Very easy to get into, and a huge repository of documents and just really important material there.
Yeah, and I was able to use their library too, which
Oh,
was
nice.
really helpful. Yeah, that's actually where I spent most of my time, actually. So yeah, like they were a big help, and they were really good about reaching out, especially after I had been there for a couple months. They were like, okay, I guess we're not getting rid of this guy, so let's help him as much as we can. No, they were great. They were just amazing. So no, I will forever be grateful for them.
Okay, so we have a couple of hands up. I do have one quick thing to say about a comment somebody made. Somebody's asking about the map. Hold on just a second here. A couple of students, I believe. Could you show the map of the Mayo area and the Fuerte River again?
Okay.
You just put that back up while we're.
Yeah. Let me.
And then while you're doing that, I believe M. Hollenstein has a question. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, M, and you can ask the question? Okay.
Maybe not.
My colleague in the School of Global Studies, Hussein, has a question. Go ahead, Hussein.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, James. This was very rich. I work in Morocco, and there was I think in this part of, not this part of Mexico, but in Sonora, maybe in the 90s, and there was about water issues. So this is great to hear, to get back to some of these issues. So I have a couple of questions. One is the theoretical framework. What theory informs your work in a sense, and particularly again in terms of making sense of water, or theorizing about water, from either indigenous or non-indigenous ways of understanding it. Another one that was fascinating is, of course, you mentioned the recession agriculture as a technology, as a way that, the indigenous peoples used to practice, and because of development, again, things have changed. So if you can speak if that's still existent or not. And another one, of course, is what are some of the implications, in addition to development, or the implications of climate change? Is water scarce? Is it becoming scarce? How are indigenous people or the Yoremes, as you said, and Yores people, deal with that? Thank you so much.
Yeah. I think there was 3 questions here.
3 questions.
Okay, I might help.
Do you want a fourth?
I think I remember the first and the third. I might help with the second, but I'll ask you to get to the second. So the first
Sure.
one is on theoretical framework. So yeah, I mean, there's just so much that, I can talk about my theoretical framework. I think it's just best to look at just influence. I think Donald Worster's work really had a huge influence on just the way he frames water and power. And just the way that it's not always governmental, or the state, right? It's not always just the state that has this power. It's often sort of state actors as well, right? Who are carrying out all these development initiatives. And I think that's really what kind of got me going. And okay, who holds a power, right, in the Fuerte Valley? Is it the state? Is it large landowners? Is it the same people often, right? So I think that is one of the main things that as far as framework goes. As far as some of these Mexican scholars, I think Boitez's work really, really helped me to see things clearly. Just the way he looks at, the way that the different regimes of Mexico over time, especially in the 20th century, sort of changed, and the way that people react to those changes, essentially. So I think those kind of 2 of the most important as far as theoretical framework goes. Second question, I lost me on the second question. The third one was about sort of climate change. So yeah, definitely. I mean, as it absolutely affects the Fuerte Valley, but I would say even more than what effects that climate change have is how individuals have access to water, essentially. So as water's flowing through, it used to just flow through the Fuerte River in front of these Mayo villages. Now it's being taken away from them, and it's not flowing in front of their villages anymore. It's flowing straight to these large landowners' properties now. And so whatever uses they have of the Fuerte River starts to sort of disappear, and they're starting to look at the river as, is this even our river anymore? Is this outsiders' water? And so sometimes there's people who are elders and people who are younger, and sometimes there's a disconnect between those who still see it as, the water and the river of the Yoreme people, and those who say this is not ours anymore. And that makes a difference. But there is sort of revitalization, I think, amongst even younger people, to sort of go back and sort of understand how important their approach to the water system is to their identity. So I think there's more revitalization. I think they're starting to understand that they need to be more united on this than anything. The second question, I don't recall what the second question was.
So it was about recession agriculture. Yeah, when you were talking about when water would recede, before, if you want to, whatever you want to call it, before the modernization drive of the irrigation infrastructure, right? So then they would just plant, these areas that receded and so on. And usually in Morocco, for instance, where I work, those areas are usually, again, held in, they are the commons of the nomads or the sedentary community or what have you. So if you can just talk about that, is that something that is still practiced, or with development things have changed?
Right. Yeah. I mean, over time, basically, yeah. I mean, as the waters, they didn't overflow anymore, right? And so as water's not overflowing anymore, and this is something I definitely talk about in the book and just didn't have time to put in the presentation, they start depending on rainwater now, way more than they used to, because they depended on it a little bit. Every time it rains, it was just a bonus essentially. But now, now they're depending a little too much on rainwater, and in fact, at times they started. There was this Yuko Conti ceremony, which was sort of like a rain dance. I guess the best way to look at it, where they perform the ceremony and water's supposed to rain after that. They used to do these at sort of these ceremonial centers, like they would do it every year before the rainy season, to sort of commemorate the coming of the rain. But villages started to depend on these performers more and more now. And so some of them actually started paying their performers to come to their village, right, to perform the ceremony, so that it would actually rain in their village now, because they relied so much on rain now. And so this was never the practice before. This actually started to change their cultural practices, where they're now depending on these performers. And now they're saying, oh, we need this rain in our village now, which, was never the case at all. So yeah, it starts to show how they have to adapt to these changes over time.
Great, thank you for those questions, Sain. Let's see, we got one or two in the chat. A comment from Dimitri, who says, thanks so much for the presentation. This is someone who studies built environments at the University of Arizona, and who is continuously disappointed by the lack of inclusion of traditional indigenous land stewardship in discussions around the land's history and best practices for living sustainably. And so Dimitri is saying, thank you so much for the presentation, because you are obviously speaking to a lot of these issues.
Yeah.
And then Andrea asks, what is the population of the Yoreme today, and have they flourished? Which I think in a way you're sort of starting to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, it depends who you talk to, right? Most people would say about 15,000. As I mentioned before, that's about the population that there was, early 20th century. And that's about what it is now. But it also depends on who you talk to, again, because how do you define a Mayo Yoreme, right? Is it self-definition? Do you say, okay, do you count everybody that considers themselves Mayo Yoreme? Is it through language? Because a lot of them are losing their language skills over time. A lot of them do not know the Mayo language anymore. So how do you determine, who was Mayo and who was not Mayo? And depending on who you talk to within a particular village, there might be 3 or 4 different explanations as far as it goes, right? I think the best way, the easiest way has been kind of to show who would self-identify as that. And again, I'd say in the past 20 years, there's been a revitalization where people are now happy to perform these ceremonies, and they're actually drawing crowds from non-Indigenous people who are coming in and say, hey, this is pretty cool. This is part of our roots, right? Let's all embrace it. Even if I'm not Indigenous, let's embrace this because this is part of our heritage. Where 20, 30 years ago, people were saying, those are a bunch of backward Indians. We don't have anything to do with them. But, you know, as much as it's good that there's a revitalization, some would say, well, is it good that, you know, they create carnivals at the same time and people are making money off of this? Is it good that some non-Mayo people are dressing up in these costumes and performing in the ceremonies, even though they're not asked to do so? So there's no like perfect, you know, explanation. There's no perfect, you know, is this good or bad? It kind of, again, it kind of depends on who you talk to. Some would say, yeah, it's great that non-Indigenous people are performed because this way the ceremonies survive, right? Others would say, yeah, but they're watering it down. They don't know why they're dancing. They don't know what any of these ceremonies mean. You know, why should they have the right to participate in this? They are not Indigenous.
You know, I think something that you said earlier, and maybe Sane was asking about, I can't remember, but you know, the whole the impacts of climatic of the warming of the climate, you know, and climate change in the region have been profound. And I think that one of the things that, at least from my experience working, you know, a bit north of where you were working, are working here in the Mayo Valley, is that, you know, storms are more powerful. The arroyos run with less frequency, but oftentimes with a lot more force. And so there's a whole sort of, you know, very broad scale shift in the ways that people are, you know, relating to this landscape, I think. You know,
Exactly.
we're in yet another moment of some pretty fast-paced change. And even, you know, at least in the Mayo, that, you know, I know the Fuerte is a much bigger volume than the Mayo River, you know, much more flow. But people, it's really starting to affect even, you know, the big irrigation districts and stuff like that too, because, or I shouldn't say even, it has for a long time.
Right. I got some questions from direct message.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So M. Hollenstein asks, how has the work influenced your engagement with social justice, such as advocating for Indigenous water rights or sovereignty? So that's a great question. I know we're running out of time, but basically, I mean, I'm doing whatever I can to help Mayo people. There's a fight right now to gain rights back to their river shores, which have over time sort of, you know, been taken from them by outsiders when they've had rights to these for, you know, centuries. And so they need these river shores to perform these ceremonies on the water. And so they're trying to get these rights back from local governments. It's been a slow process. I'm trying to help them. I've actually helped to draw a few maps. I'm terrible at it, trying to get better at it. Cartographers are geniuses, in my opinion. And I want to use some of these maps to show over time how they've lost these access to the river shores and why that's important, why this is important to not just Mayo people, but to the heritage of the local people as well, right? To everybody, right? It's their heritage, it's their history. And so I'm doing what I can. I was working on this stuff, and then COVID hit. It's been hard to sort of recover from this. Some of these elders have passed on, some of these leaders. So, you know, I'm trying to work with some new people on this stuff. But it's a slow process, right? Especially when people don't have, you know, access to computers or telephones and things like that. So I'm doing whatever I can when I can. And hopefully at some point we could make some inroads to helping people to gain some of these rights back. And I'll do, you know, whatever I can as an ally in whatever capacity I can. Another question, I had John Wright, who said, were the Mexican people that occupied the Mayo land settlers from central Mexico? That's a good question. A lot of people don't really know. The best guess is that, and there's an ancient story that comes from the Yaqui people that says that at one point everybody lived in the Yaqui Valley, and then essentially there was getting like too many people were, too many people were taking up the land. And so they basically said, okay, we're going to go occupy the Mayo Valley and the Fuerte Valley because we know those are also, great lands. And so we're just going to continue to be one people, but we're going to take those lands up and it'll be easier for us to maintain ourselves if we do that. There is definitely archaeology which shows that there was some influence from Central Mexico, from Mexica people, from even Central Mexico before that, right? And so there was definitely some back and forth connections between people in the Fuerte Valley and the Valley of Mexico. But to what extent these people came from there, nobody knows for sure yet. I think it's, archaeology is still finding a lot of things, and maybe we'll know in the next 50 years. I guess that questions is going to be answered at a much later time, and not by me, at least not right now.
You had two questions in the.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Apropos of that last question or that last comment, Cynthia Ratting's book, Bountiful Deserts, actually does a really good job of surveying the existing archaeology and then kind of tying it into the colonial period and northern Sinaloa and southern Sonora. That's a really good read.
It's an incredible book, as most of all of her work is, really.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, her work I should have mentioned too, because her work was absolutely influential in this book too.
Sure, yeah. We do have another question in the chat. Somebody's asking about if you found the archives of Sikai, the sugar cooperative, and then they would like to know more about if the Mayo refer to any new technology exchanged with the American colonists that arrived in the region.
Yeah, good question. So I've heard a lot of different things about the about the Sikai archive. I've heard that they burned up in a fire because there was a fire at the where they were held. Have other people told me no, so and so has them, and then I couldn't find them. That person they said has them doesn't have them. So I really don't know. I've been asking around. I continue to ask around, and maybe one day I'll find them. Who knows? That would be great if I can find them. I did find some papers, some documents and stuff. But apparently there is still this archive. So if anybody out there knows where it is, please email me. Let me know. And then another question was about irrigation technologies. So yes, I mean, some of these American U.S. colonists definitely influenced these irrigation technologies. So for instance, these pumps were pretty much all from U.S. companies. Mikhail Wolf's book, Water and the Revolution, talks more about this than I do, a little more. I do mention it in my book. But as these technologies sort of advanced, essentially, they allowed smaller farmers to use them. It was usually large farmers who use them, but smaller farmers actually were able to eventually get access to them. But they were never cheap. They were never cheap to use. They were never, it was very hard to get the money to invest in these things. So Mayo farmers, generally speaking, usually did not have access to them. They usually had to trade a percentage of their crop and trade that to a farmer, somebody who was, not a large farmer necessarily, but somebody who had a little bit of money in order to use these things. But as I mentioned before, over time, water became so expensive that these farmers didn't want this trade anymore. They wanted to monopolize all the water themselves. yeah, but these technologies are absolutely critical, at least in this first era that I talk about, in allowing Mayo people to gain access to the river.
Okay, well, let's see. I don't see any other questions, but I have one last one for you, which is maybe you could tell us a little bit about your new research.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna be looking at indigenous curanderas, largely in Northwest Mexico. Already did some preliminary research. I went to Fuerte Valley. I went to the Yaqui Valley so far. I went to Chihuahua as well. Was not able to find anybody to interview yet, but I have a good amount of interviews so far. I have like 8 interviews or something of indigenous curanderas. And it's largely going to be about how curanderas in late 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st century, how they basically adapted to a landscape that is constantly evolving. So for instance, as I interviewed some of these Yaqui curanderas in the Yaqui Valley, they were telling me over time as they lost connection and any connection of water in the Yaqui River, this completely changed the ecosystems there. So some of the plants and even animals that they depended on to concoct many of their cures were no longer available now. And so where do they go now? What do they do? Do they, I mean, I didn't know. I mean, I was thinking, can you just replace them with other plants, right? Is there other plants that work for these things? And they're like, no, there's no replacement for certain plants. Only this one plant works. And so now we got to figure out, do we go to this other state to get them? Do we have to sometimes get it shipped directly from Mexico City, which has a large collection of, plants that come from all over Mexico. And so how do they adapt essentially to the changes in their natural landscape? And what does this mean to their standing within their communities as well, right? And I do focus on some men, some curanderos, but I'm focusing largely on women. And so specifically, these women have a pretty important standing in their communities. And so as they are losing access to many of their cures, does this lower their standing in their communities, and how are they sort of treated over time? So I'm still sort of fashioning the research and what exactly I'm looking at. But I want to look also again, I went to the water archives, right? And so looking at how this irrigation infrastructure affects the natural landscape in which I'm talking about, right? In which the curanderas are accessing or not accessing, right? These plants and animals too, right? And so, yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited about the work. It's gonna take me some time. I have many years until it will be done, but I'm pretty excited about going back and doing more research.
Excellent. Well, we'll be waiting for that next book to come out, James.
Absolutely.
In a year.
Yeah, a year. I wish it was that fast.
Well, thank you so much for this excellent talk and for the great Q&A. Thanks for your work, your time. Thanks for your support of the Yoreme of Northern Sinaloa. And also, for those who are still on here, we're going to make a video of this talk available on our Southwest Center website. We have a YouTube channel, so please tune into that. And we'll also make available information for James's book and other stuff. So I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and thank you so much again for joining us. And James, we'll follow up with you soon.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks everybody for coming.